Tonight's program is what to do if your child rejects Judaism. So, the very beginning of our national story, in the first book of the Torah, the book of Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 15, so we have a story that takes place right after Abram. He wasn't called Abraham yet. His name was changed. So Abram just launched a battle to rescue his nephew, Lot. His nephew, Lot, was captured in a war, and Abraham goes on a dangerous rescue mission. He sends his troops, his 318 troops, to rescue his nephew. And he's victorious. He's successful. And right after this success, God comes to Abraham and says the following: Abraham, fear not. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Now, we're not going to discuss tonight why Abraham might have been afraid that God has to reassure him that everything's going to be okay. Abraham might have been afraid before the war, but now he's been victorious. So it's not so clear why God has to reassure him. Don't be afraid. Your reward's going to be very great. That's for another evening. But that's what God says to Abraham. And Abraham says to God, that's very nice that you want to bless me and you want to reward me. He says, but what can you possibly give me, seeing that I'm childless? I don't have any progeny. I don't have any offspring. And so whatever you give me, basically I'm an old man now. And when I pass away, everything's going to go kaput. So what is the use, he says to God, of giving me anything, of blessing me? He basically says that without children, there's going to be no continuity to whatever blessings you give to me. So God says to Abram, not only will you have a child, promises Abraham that you will have a child, but it says that God takes Abram outside, and he says to him, look up in the sky, and look at all the stars, if you can count them. If you can't, there are too many of them to count. He says, so too will your descendants be. So God says to him, look, you're concerned about continuity, you're concerned about having no offspring. He says, not only will you have a son, but you're going to basically have a huge family coming out of you. And the Torah basically tells us that Abram trusted God. He trusted God's promise. And the Torah says that God considered this trust as an act of righteousness. The fact that Abram trusted God's promise for a tremendous amount of family, God considered that a righteous thing, that Abraham had so much trust in him. And then God says to him, I'm going to make another promise. God says, look, Abram, I brought you here to this land from the Ur-Kasdim, from basically what's now Iraq or Babylon. And I brought you to this land, which back then was called Canaan, the land of Canaan. Now we know it's called Israel. And he says, I brought you here to this land to inherit it. And Abram says, how do I know that I'm going to inherit the land? Now, what's very puzzling is that we know that Abraham was given a bizarre, amazing promise. That here, as a very, very old man, God says, you're going to have children. And not just a child, you're going to have a huge family. Which sounds like science fiction. And yet it says Abraham trusted that. Abraham believed that. And then God says, and you're going to inherit this land. And all of a sudden, Abraham has problems believing that. He says to God, how do I know I'm going to inherit the land? So what's going on here? Why is Abram having such a hard time with this promise? So Rabbi Elimelech of Grodzinsk suggested the following approach to this story. He says the truth is that Abram totally trusted both promises. He totally trusted that he would have offspring, and he totally trusted that he would inherit the land. But what he wondered about is whether his children and the generations after him would also trust in these promises. That's what was irritating Abram. Abraham was wondering whether or not his descendants would be as worthy as he is. Because don't forget, God is making these promises to Abram because he's a man of great faith. And he is deserving of the land because of his faith. And so what Abraham's wondering is not that I'm going to get the land. I trust you, God, on that. But how do I know that I'll be able to bequeath, to inherit my trust and my faith in you to my descendants? That's what I don't know about. And so we see at the very beginning of Jewish history, there are concerns about our continuity, whether our mission, whether our story is going to continue. It's one thing for a family to have values and to have commitments, but how do we know that our children are going to have the same values and same commitments? And that's what Abraham was asking at the very genesis, at the very beginning of Jewish history. And in our generation, this concern about whether our children will follow in our footsteps has become a very pressing issue across the entire landscape of the Jewish community. There was a disturbing ad in a Jewish publication a while back that sounded the alarm of this issue with a very disturbing headline that read, "If you are Jewish, the chances are that your grandchildren won't be." And the ad wanted people to think about that for a minute. If we're Jewish, the chances are that our grandchildren will not be. And this exiting of Judaism, this exodus away from Judaism, takes many different forms. The Pew Report, which is a very sophisticated analysis, they do many different studies, but they did a study of the Jewish community not that long ago, where they found that way over 30% of Jewish millennials, young Jewish adults, simply do not identify with Judaism as a religion at all. They may identify as Jews. I'm a Jewish person, and my Jewishness is a culture, it's an ethnicity, it's a heritage, but they do not accept anything about Judaism as a religion. And that number is only growing now. There are, unfortunately, significant, large numbers of Jews who embrace other religions and other spiritual paths. I've mentioned here before that in many studies, about 25 to 30% of Buddhists in North America come from a Jewish background. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews today who are in churches, having converted to Christianity. We know that Jewish people are overly represented in all of the Eastern religions, from Baha'i to Sikhism to Hinduism to Jainism. And the same thing goes with all of the mind-controlling cults that exist in the world today. Jewish people are overly represented in terms of our percentage in the population, and as well in all of the different New Age spiritual movements that exist. We simply have a tremendous number of Jews who've switched affiliation to something else. But the greatest problem is what Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach used to call Jews for nothing. And this is basically massive assimilation going on in the Jewish community today, where Jewish people basically become secular. and they have no spiritual path whatsoever. And this trend of assimilation and marrying out of the faith has skyrocketed over the past decades. The numbers are staggering. And even in the most traditional sectors of the Jewish community, there is a tremendous struggle with faith. For example, in a 6-year study done by the Avichai Foundation, they found that 25% of students who enter university as Orthodox Jews come out not Orthodox. 25% of traditional Orthodox Jewish students lose their religion in their university years. So what should families do when facing situations like these? When teens or young adults just say they're no longer interested, they're no longer going to participate in traditional family gatherings. There are many Jewish people who, for them, their Jewishness is, let's say, having Friday night meals. And their teenager or young adult who used to come says, I'm just not coming anymore. I'm not interested. They're not going to participate. They're not coming to the synagogue for the high holidays this year. Or young people who were previously observant. They kept Shabbat, they kept kosher, they prayed every day, and they just slowly stop. So what are families to do? And the first thing that I would like to think about with you is what people should not do. What they should not do. First of all, I think it's critical that people do not beat themselves up. Parents tend to do that. They tend to beat themselves up, and they see this as a personal failure, and they see this as a rejection of themselves and who they are, and they take it in the very worst kind of way. The truth is that there are no guarantees in life, and a family can do everything right, and they can raise their children in absolutely the right way. The Midrash, the rabbinic Midrash to Koheles, the book of Ecclesiastes, quotes the verse which says that a 3-plied cord will not easily break. But the truth is, it can break. And so if you raise your children perfectly, the chances are they will stay on the path of Judaism. But there are no guarantees. And just like we know that one of our greatest righteous people, King David, had a son, Avshalom, who was really not such a good kid. And one of our most righteous kings, Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, fathered one of the most evil people in Jewish history, Manasseh. So there are no guarantees, regardless of how righteous and upstanding and perfect families raise their kids. So the first thing I think we have to bear in mind is that families should not beat themselves up. Number 2, they should not try and spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out what happened and to assign blame. It must have been their Hebrew school teacher. It must have been this. It must have been that. We did this wrong. The truth is that people are incredibly complicated, and life is incredibly complex. And it's not so simple to get inside people's heads and totally understand people and their lives and what makes them do what they do. So we don't really have the ability to fully understand why people end up doing what they do. And so, number 1, we shouldn't beat ourselves up. And number 2, we shouldn't spend a lot of time on a blame game. Number 3, we should not criticize or put down our children's new interests, their new friends, the new way that they dress, their new activities. This will only be counterproductive. Trust me, children who disappoint their parents by cutting their ties with Judaism, they understand quite well that their parents don't approve. They don't need to be lectured more and more and more and more. So one of the greatest mistakes is for parents to just lace into their children and criticize and attack and put down what they're doing and who they're spending time with and their activities and their interests, etc. And then parents should not argue with their children about Judaism. They should not try to convince their children that they're wrong. They should not try to prove to their children that they're making a mistake. They should not send their children videos or articles to straighten their children out. It's not that these activities are wrong. It's not wrong to try to help educate your children, but it's all a matter of timing. And if you try to do this when children are not receptive, not only will they not listen to or read or consider whatever you're going to say or send them, it's just going to drive them further away, and they will be less receptive to anything in the future. So what families have to do is not panic and immediately feel that they have to solve this crisis, because it's not going to happen. They're not going to say the magic word. They're not going to get their child to speak to the rabbi, and the rabbi is going to straighten everything out. What needs to happen, and this is a slow process, is there has to be a working with the child, and I'm speaking about child here also as adult children. We could be speaking about someone in their 30s. But parents need to work with their children so that one day they may be receptive to hearing information that might come to influence them. But these 4 rules, I think, are very critical. Not to beat ourselves up, not to lay blame, not to criticize, and not to argue. The second major rule, and there aren't many, is to invest in the relationship. If parents are going to do anything that may be helpful, it's to invest in their relationship with their children. And every ounce of investment is worth its weight in gold. That's where the energy should be put. The holy Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, was approached by a father, this is hundreds of years ago, and the father was complaining that my son has basically stopped being a faithful Jew. My son has given up everything of his Jewishness. He's now totally disconnected from being Jewish. And the father was so angry and bitter and hurt. And the Baal Shem Tov said to him, you have to now love your child even more. You have to love your child more. And just as God loves all of his children, every single one of us, no matter how righteous we are, or no matter how unrighteous we are, so parents have to love all of their children, even if their children disappoint them, even if their children are not following in their footsteps spiritually. Aside from loving children more, there has to be an effort to keep open lines of communication. One of the most important things to do is simply to listen to our children. Just listen to them. Talk less and listen more. That's why the old saying is that we were given 2 ears and 1 tongue. More listening, less speaking. Because generally speaking, parents will not say the right thing. And parents are not going to be able to solve their problems initially quickly. But one thing they can do to help build their relationship with their children and invest in that relationship is listening. Because the child does not think their parents are going to be interested in listening to them, because they feel that since they've disappointed their parents and their parents are angry with them or furious with them and upset with them, their parents want nothing to do with them. They don't want to hear about what's going on in their child's life. And so parents would be well advised to listen to their children. Listen carefully. Try to understand what's going on in their child's life. And that might mean showing an interest in what their child is doing now. It's going to be a little bit surprising to the child. The child is doing things that are antagonistic to the parents. But it would not be a bad idea for the parents to show some kind of interest. Not an interest that implies that they approve. But let's say a young Jewish person has left Judaism and embraced Buddhism. Well, it wouldn't be a bad thing for the parents to ask their child, what is it like when you meditate? Not a hostile question like putting down meditation, but being curious. You're meditating a lot. What happens? What is it like? What are you getting out of it? So first of all, the parent is finding out more about their kids. But also they're bridging to their children by showing an interest, by asking questions. And it's good for parents to ask open-ended questions. Not the kind of questions that children can say yes or no. What you want to promote is dialogue, is discussion. You want to keep open lines of communication. You want to keep that muscle strong. There's a muscle of communication. And if people don't communicate, that muscle atrophies, and the relationship atrophies. And so, even though you may not be talking about what you feel is the most important issue, which is why you should be thinking about coming back to Judaism, that may not be on the table yet. But you need to have that muscle of communication working and strong. And so we need to listen to our children, ask them questions, let them speak, let them be open-ended questions where they get a chance to express yourself, and take an interest in what our children are saying. Parents need to build rapport with their children, to build trust. Because what often happens is the children are now afraid that my parents have an agenda. And all they're going to try to do now is bring me back to being Jewish. And so they may interpret anything as a veiled attempt by their parents to manipulate them and to get them to come back to their faith. And so what parents need to do is to communicate with their children in ways where the children don't see an agenda, where the children see my parents are genuinely interested in me, and they're not spending their energy trying to sabotage my new life. And so what has to happen is that the lines of communication are kept open, and what that does is it builds rapport, it builds trust. And parents want to intensify the feelings of love and closeness between them and their children. They may want to reminisce about things that took place when the person was younger, about good times, take out old family photographs. but spend time doing things that are pleasurable. Spend time doing things that everyone can enjoy. And build on those feelings of closeness. And that is the most critical thing to do after families learn not to blunder, not to do the things that are going to be harmful. They say in medicine, what's the first rule of medicine? Do no harm. So once families learn that golden rule of not harming their relationship with their children, do the kind of things that are able to intensify the closeness, intensify the feelings of trust and love, and a feeling that this is my family, and they love me, and I belong here. And even though we don't see eye to eye on religion, but this is my place. These are my people. In psychology, they speak about joining with someone. Joining with someone. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov tells a famous story of a young prince that just went out of his mind. And he began to believe that he was a turkey. And this young prince, who lived in a fabulous palace where they had all the wealth in the world, would basically spend his entire day under the huge dining room table in his family's palace. He was naked. He took off all his clothing. After all, turkeys don't wear clothing. And he would hop around on his feet, crouch down beneath the table, and he would pick with his mouth at little scraps of food that they threw under the table for him. And that's the prince. Nebuch, how sad. The prince now thinks he's a turkey. And all of the efforts by the king and the king's wife, the queen, to help their son didn't work. The son wouldn't listen to anyone, all the psychologists and all the sorcerers and all the therapists. Nothing helped, nothing worked. They couldn't get through to their son. One day a wise man comes to the palace and says, I think I may be able to help your son. And the king is thrilled, and immediately this wise man takes off all his clothing, and he gets under the table with the prince, the turkey prince, and he gets onto his legs, he crouches down, and he starts picking also with his mouth at the little scraps of food under the table. And the prince is shocked. Who is this here? And the wise man says, I'm just like you, I'm a turkey. And they became very friendly. And that's how they spend their days, under the table, picking at the food. One day, the wise man has a prearranged signal with the people living a normal life, and they throw down to him 2 pairs of trousers. And the wise man puts on the trousers. And the prince is looking at him like, what are you doing? And he says, what do you mean, what am I doing? No one says that a turkey is not allowed to have pants on. So the wise man put on the trousers, and he's still picking at the food, but he now has pants on. And the prince, finally, he does the same thing. Look, if a turkey can wear pants, I'll wear pants. Why not? And then a few days later, with a signal, they throw down 2 shirts. And also, he says to the prince, you know what? There's nothing that says a turkey can't wear a shirt. And the prince finally puts on a shirt too. And then instead of sitting and hunching on their back legs and bopping up and down, so the wise man just sits down like a human being. He sits. And he starts to take the food onto the table with his hand. And he says to the prince, you know, there's no reason why a turkey can't sit down. It's more relaxing than having to balance ourselves on our legs and try to hunch like that. And the turkey prince does the same thing. And finally, after all of this work, the young prince is emerging from under the table, fully dressed, eating at the table, sitting there, because he understands that there's no reason why a turkey cannot sit at the table with the rest of his family and eat food. Now, he might think for the rest of his life that he's still a turkey, But the wise man has accomplished something amazing. And I suspect that after a while, he's going to come to understand that if you look like a human being, and you talk like a human being, and you eat like a human being, and you sit like a human being, you're a human being and not a turkey. I had a similar situation many years ago when a student of mine was almost murdered. Someone broke into her apartment and stabbed her. And fortunately, she survived the attack, and amazingly, the assailant was caught immediately. And there was a trial about 6 months later. And she asked me if I would come to the trial because she was terrified of having to sit in the room maybe just 10 feet away from this person that stabbed her. And she felt it would be almost impossible to sit there without falling to pieces. So I said I would definitely be there for her and I would sit with her. And we were sitting together side by side in this courtroom, and I could tell that she was freaking out. I didn't even have to look at her, but through the corner of my eye, with my peripheral vision, I was able to tell that she wasn't breathing, that her breath was very shallow, and she was breathing very rapidly. She could hardly even catch her breath. That's how upset she was. That's how freaked out she was being there. Now, I know that I could have turned to her and I could have said, listen, just relax, everything's going to be okay. But I know that if that was me and someone said to me, just relax, I would punch them in the face. Sure, just relax, like it's the easiest thing in the world to do. So I didn't say that. What I did was I started to breathe just like she was breathing. I started to take more shallow breaths, and I started to breathe rapidly. And within about 30 seconds, we were breathing exactly the same. And then what I did was I began to slow down my breathing and take much deeper breaths. And guess what she did? She followed right along. So I joined with her. And basically, when two people have that kind of rapport, if I change my breathing, she's going to follow right along. And so I'm using this with you as a metaphor for one of the most powerful ways that we can build rapport with our children and to be a launching pad for influence. When we've basically joined with our children, we showed an interest in what they're doing. If a child, for example, starts to play very, very wild rock music in a rock band, many families will be upset by that. What kind of music is that? That's not kosher music. But those parents might be smart to ask their son, could you play for me some of your songs? Maybe rehearse. I'll go to the basement and I'll hear you rehearse. To show an interest in what someone's doing, to join with them, is extremely powerful. Once we've invested in the relationship, and once we've built this kind of trust and rapport and love, we now can think about ways in which we might be able to influence our children. And the most important rule to remember is that we do not influence by what we say. We influence by who we are. Again, much less talking. There's a saying that if you want to fill up a saucer with tea, you overflow the teacup. Don't try pouring the tea directly onto the saucer. The most effective way of influencing someone else is by not trying to influence them. It's by changing who you are. and allowing who you are to emerge, to pour out. The idea is to take the focus off your child and put the focus on yourself. Because the truth is that you don't have any ability to change someone else. A child that's grown up already, if a child is 5 years old, you can tell them what to do. Once someone is 15, 18, 22, 28, you can't tell them anymore what to do. What you do have ownership over is yourself. You're able to model for someone else. And so by changing who we are, we're able to indirectly influence others. The reason that indirect communication is so powerful is that there's no resistance to it. When someone feels they're being sold, when someone feels that someone's trying to influence them, their defenses go up. When you communicate indirectly, it is much more powerful. You know, when the Torah was first given to the Jewish people, we're told that the mountain was on fire and there was lightning. It was a cataclysmic event. The giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai was mind-blowing, how powerful the experience was just on a physical level. It was overwhelming. And yet, what happened shortly after they received that Torah? They built a golden calf, and they worshipped it. The second commandments, the second set of commandments that were given, Moses broke the first tablets. The second set of tablets that were given, we're told, were given quietly, without the fanfare. And that we've had now for over 3,300 years. So when we try to forcefully, strongly, directly influence people, we meet a lot of resistance. When the communication is soft, it's indirect, it's subtle, there's no resistance. That's one of the reasons why telling stories is one of the most powerful ways of communicating. Because when you tell a story, people's guard is down. They just think it's a nice story, and they listen. And often people put themselves into the story. And if the story has a message, if the story has a point to it, the person has to extract that message themselves. If you have to tell the person the message, you have to say, and you know what this is all about? It loses its power. But when you tell us an amazing story that draws someone in, and they listen to it, and they've understood the message, that is extremely powerful. I've told a story before that when I was a student at Yeshiva University, there was a phys ed requirement. And one of the options was a class given by Professor Harvey Sober, who was a professor of Hebrew, and he taught martial arts. He was like a 10th degree black belt. He was very, very high ranked. And every year he would put on a martial arts exhibition. And he began the demonstrations by taking a cinder block and smashing it as hard as he could, and the thing would just break into a million pieces. Now, the truth is, everyone has seen this kind of demonstration. And the truth is, a cinder block is not solid. A cinder block is poured concrete. It's got air, and it's got, the particles of sand and some concrete. But it's not like a garden rock. A garden rock is totally solid. And he would end the demonstration by taking a garden rock, and he would just softly touch it, and they exploded into a million pieces. When I saw this was amazing. The forceful break, when he smashed the cinder block as hard as he could, okay, I'm sure that someone could do it if they are trained and they practice and they hit that rock hard enough. But for him to smash into smithereens a garden rock, which is much harder just by touching it, that blew my brains out of my head. That's the impact of what I call a soft break. That the softer the communication, the more indirect the communication, the more subtle the communication, the more powerful the communication is going to be. Let me just review for a second. The 3 steps that we've covered are: number 1, what not to do. Don't criticize, don't attack, don't argue. Number 2, invest in the relationship. Communication, ask questions, listen, build trust, build rapport, intensify the feelings of love. And finally, ways of influencing others, primarily indirectly, subtly. Primarily not by directly telling people things, but by modeling for people. If your message to your child is that Judaism is beautiful, and Judaism is delicious, and Judaism is worth investing in, don't say that. You're going to sound like a salesperson. Show by your life that Judaism is beautiful, that Judaism enriches your life, that you are gaining tremendous benefits in terms of your happiness, in terms of your sense of fulfillment, in terms of your sense of spirituality. Let that shine through who you are, not through what you tell someone. And then one 4th principle, which is don't give up. Don't give up. In the Torah, we know that there was a struggle in the descendants of Abraham. Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And we know there was some tension there between those 2 sons. But we know that the mission of Abraham, the spiritual path of Abraham, went through his son Isaac. But Isaac had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. And we know there was some tension there about where the spiritual line was going to go. The Torah tells us that Isaac loved Esau, who was not the more righteous of the 2 sons. His mother Rebekah loved Jacob more. And Rebekah understood that Esau was not really qualified. He was not an appropriate choice to be his father's successor spiritually. And we know that she engineered an entire deception in order to make sure that her husband Isaac would give the blessings to who she felt was the proper son. Not that she was the smartest person in the world. She received a prophecy from God. She was told by God that Jacob is going to be the one. And she needed to make sure that would happen. And so in a very famous scene, Jacob is dressed up like his brother, Esau. And he's got animal skins on his arms because Esau, we know, was very hairy. His father, Isaac, was blind. Isaac couldn't see. And this is the moment when Isaac is supposed to bless his son. And Isaac thinks that he's giving the blessing to Esau, but it's really Jacob in front of him. And it's a very tense moment. It's a very tense moment. Because Isaac is suspicious. He says, it sounds like Jacob, but it feels like Esau that's in front of me. And when you read the story, you're getting nervous. Is the whole deception going to be exploded? And then at the moment right before Isaac blesses Jacob, the Torah says that he smelt his garments. He smelled his garments. Vayarach es begodov. And our sages in the Midrash say, don't read this as that he smelled his garments. The word garments sounds like the word bogdov, traitors, rebels. And so what you see in the Torah is something amazing. That what is it that immediately precedes Isaac giving the blessings to Jacob? Isaac is smelling the traitors that will come out of Jacob. The rebels. That's pretty amazing. That's what ultimately gets the blessings for Jacob. The fact that he has these descendants who are going to be traitors and rebels. So what kind of rebels are these? And the Midrash tells two stories of people who were terrible rebels against Judaism. One of them was asked to go into the temple before the temple was raided by non-Jews, and the non-Jews were afraid to go into the temple. They probably saw Spielberg's movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they probably saw what happened when you open up that ark. You get it incinerated. So they said to this guy, Yossi Mishisa, they said, well, you go in and you bring stuff out. And whatever you bring out, you can keep the first thing and we'll get everything else. So he comes out with a beautiful candelabra, a beautiful golden candelabra. And they got very jealous and they said, no, that's too nice for you. We'll keep that. You go back and get something else for yourself. And he started to shudder. And he said, no, I already angered my Father in heaven once. I'm not going to do it again. And they began to argue with him. And they began to bribe him. Look, if you go in again, we'll let you off of taxes for 3 years. I'm not going to do it. I already made God angry once. And then they begin to torture him physically. And he says, I already angered my Father in heaven. I'm not going back again. And they end up finally killing him. This is one of the holy rebels. One of our holy rebels. And the Talmud says, the Midrash says, that this person's soul went directly up to heaven. The other story is someone who was a nephew of Yossi ben Yoezer, one of the great sages. His name was Yochum ish Troros. And one day, the Romans are leading his uncle to be crucified. He's on a little beat-up donkey, and they're taking him out to be killed. And this Yochum ish Troros is a big shot. He's a fancy guy, and he's riding on a beautiful horse. And he looks at his uncle, and he mocks his uncle. And he says, ha! Look at that pathetic animal that you're riding on, that broken down donkey. And look at this beautiful steed that I'm riding on. And his uncle says to him, you know what? If this is what happens, meaning if what's happening to me, if this is what happens to someone who is loyal and faithful to God, imagine what can happen to someone who is going to be rebelling against God and unfaithful to God. And the Midrash says that these words entered his heart, the heart of Yochum ish Troros, like the poison of a snake. And he went home and he basically executed himself because he was so broken. And yet the Midrash says that his soul went together with his uncle that was being crucified. Both went up to heaven. This is what the Midrash speaks about when it says that Isaac smelled not the clothing of Jacob, but the traitors that would come out of Jacob. We should never give up, because even the worst traitors, they can change. At the end of the day, they can change. And what is it that got them to change? So for Yossi Mishisa, what impacted him was just being in a holy place. He was evil, but he went into the holy temple, and just being there changed him. And in the same way, we see young adults. I just spoke to someone last week, a young student here from Toronto, no interest in Judaism. And he went to Israel on a birthright trip, and just being in the Holy Land transformed him. And right now, he's dedicating himself to becoming a serious spiritual Jew. Being in a holy place can transform people. And what transformed Yochum Ish Tzroros? It was an encounter with a holy person. It was meeting his uncle and having that brief exchange. When you meet someone that's inspiring, not someone that's going to lecture you or criticize you, but if you meet someone and that you say to yourself, this person is impressive, this person I'm inspired by, those kinds of experiences can transform even the worst of our rebels, the worst of our traitors. One of my first teachers was Rabbi Benjamin Blech, and I saw something that he wrote not long ago about the 4 children at the Passover Seder. And when you look at the Passover Seder, it has the 4 children. There's the Chacham, the wise child, then the Rasha, the wicked child, then there's the Tam, the simple child, and then there's the Eino Yadei Elishol, the one that can't even ask. And he asked a very simple question. It seems that these children are in a strange order, meaning what would make more sense is to have on one end the righteous child, the wise child, and on the other extreme the wicked child. That's the extremes. And in the middle you put the two that, doesn't know how to ask, or they're simple. Why do we have the order that we have in the Haggadah? Rabbi Blech suggested that it may be that these children are in reverse chronological order. The last child mentioned is the Eino Yadei Elishol. It's a kid, a little baby. A little baby doesn't know how to ask questions, doesn't know how to ask. A little baby. And then there's the simple child, meaning that not too sophisticated yet. Cute little kid, not going to come up with any, brilliant attacks against Judaism. But then they become cynical teenagers. And they go through a rebellious stage in life. That's the child that's described as the Rasha, the one that's not so nice, the one that's not good, because they basically have become cynical and rejected. But then there's the 4th stage, the Chacham, meaning that people's rebellions don't last forever. And people often mature in life. And I've seen many situations where a young person in their teens or early 20s that rejects Judaism, when they get married and they have children, they return to it. Or God forbid, there's a crisis in their life. A parent, God forbid, passes away. That might bring someone back to their tradition, their faith. So we should never give up, ever give up, because we don't know what's going to happen in the end. I want to share one last idea to think about, and I think it is one of the most critical ideas. Parents can feel powerless when a child rejects Judaism. But if I explain tonight, there are always things that parents can do. But there's one vital thing that I haven't discussed yet. And let me share this with you. The Ksav Sofer was a great, great rabbinic sage in Pressburg. And in his city, there was a Jew who was sentenced to death for a crime that he didn't commit. And the Ksav Sofer did everything that he could do to try to save the condemned man. He met with officials in the city. He probably tried to arrange for bribes. He handled and he dealt and he did every possible thing that you could do. To no avail. Nothing worked. And the night before the hanging, the Ksav Sofer was broken and he cried himself to sleep. As he slept, his saintly father, the Chassam Sofer, who was already no longer in this world, came to him in a dream. And his father said to him in a dream, and he had a very angry face, his father. And his father said, "How can you sleep when an innocent man with a wife and children is going to be put to death? How can you sleep?" So the Ksav Sofer said, "What can I do? I tried everything." And his father said, "But why aren't you praying? You have to pray. Pray, pray." And so the Ksav Sofer immediately got out of bed and he gathered the whole town together. And they went to the synagogue and they all prayed all night long for the salvation of this man. And in the morning, miraculously, the judge agreed to investigate the case, and the man's life was spared. One of our prayers that we say, people who have the practice of praying from the Jewish prayer book, so the main set of prayers, there are 19 blessings. And one of the requests that we make is we make a request for people to repent. As you know, all of our prayers are in the plural. We don't ask only for ourselves, we ask for the community. And we pray every day that since God desires people to do tshuva, people to repent and come back to Him, we should have in mind when we're saying that prayer the people in our lives that we know that need to return to God. Aside from the benefit that this might actually have, it might cause someone that we care about to meet someone that's going to inspire them. It might cause the people that we care about to be a little bit more open and curious. But aside from the fact that we might actually help the people we're concerned about, praying affects us. Praying makes us softer people. And the fact that we have become softer impacts the way we interact with our children. So we should never underestimate the importance of praying for our children. We should do it in our own words. Every parent that has an issue they're dealing with should just speak to God every day, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is, and ask God to help. Beg with tears. But a parent has to do that. How could a parent not pray? I'm going to conclude with sharing with you a story in the Torah, in the 6th chapter of Exodus. When God appeared to Moses, and God gave him the role of leading the Jewish people out of Egypt. He said, "You're going to be the one to go down to Egypt and take the Jewish people out." And we know that Moses initially refused. Moses is protesting and arguing, "What are you picking on me for?" And one of the reasons Moses gives that he should not be the one to go down to speak to Pharaoh, he says, "I have a speech impediment. I don't speak well." So God says to Moses, "Don't worry. Aaron, your brother, will be your spokesperson." So God says to him, Aaron, your brother, will speak in your place. So Nachmanides, the Ramban, asks a very obvious question. Why didn't God simply heal Moses of his speech impediment? Why didn't God just do that? And the Ramban says, you know why he didn't? Because Moses didn't ask for it. He didn't pray to have his speech impediment healed. God was prepared with the cure. God was prepared to heal him. But it was withheld because the request was never made. Asking is necessary. Praying for a child who has moved away from Judaism that they should return is one of the most vital things that we can do.